the cynic could imagine a scenario where Russia is close to Iran and Iran is close to Hamas, and everybody winks and smiles, and this war breaks out just at the most inopportune time for Ukraine, which was kind of the theme of the piece we wrote called Minority Report, where we talked about the chaos in Congress that I mentioned earlier. And so you don't have to be too paranoid to connect these dots. And then again, one front war with a nuclear superpower is bad. A two-front war with all of the sensitivities in the Middle East is worse. And then a three-front war with another nuclear power, i.e. China over Taiwan, would be, boy, I mean, not good.
On this episode of What the Finance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Doomberg for the fourth time. So the first guest to come back 4 times. So he keeps putting up with me, but it's because we have amazing conversations. So thanks so much for coming back on the podcast today.
Well, you know what they say, Anthony, 4th time's a charm.
Yeah, hopefully this one will be the good interview. No, definitely not. So my first question is actually about our last conversation, because then we were talking about how the US policy is really driving sort of our enemies together. Or I guess Western enemies together. So I was interested to hear your opinion about, I guess, current policy and whether that's changed since our last conversation in April.
Well, the most pronounced thing that has changed since our last conversation in April, of course, is the outbreak of literal war in the Middle East, which is, of course, a disastrous situation by all measures, humanitarian, geopolitical, and economical, potentially, depending on how things evolve. And obviously that is a fast-moving situation with an enormous degree of emotion on both sides, and we saw a real amazing sort of news cycle earlier this week, where it was alleged originally that there was a bomb that was dropped on a hospital, that hundreds of people were killed, and of course the news cycle has since perhaps turned to a different explanation as to those events. But regardless, both sides have become, I think, dangerously close to the abyss on a war that could proliferate well beyond the Gaza Strip, which is obviously a nightmare scenario, and frankly, on many people's, World War III catalysts, game theory and planning, for military strategies around the world. Breaking out of hostilities in the Middle East could very quickly escalate to very, very, very dangerous situation, even more dangerous than it is today, of course, which is a catastrophe for those directly involved. And so I do think that is the big unknown. That is the big impossible to model, very dangerous scenario that faces macro analysts today. You can imagine, if Iran became directly involved, and then there were sort of countermeasures to that, and then OPEC was forced to unify and reduce supply and exports to the rest of the world, that things could get ugly very, very quickly. Let's hope that it doesn't.
Do you think that's, I guess, maybe the first stage or like the greatest risk to occur, that we do see maybe this a trade war between a lot of these global powers? Do you think that could happen?
I think the immediate risk is a hot war expands beyond Israel and the Gaza Strip, even just Hezbollah from the north, which of course Israel would interpret as a direct assault from Iran and might retaliate accordingly. And of course we have, Senator Lindsey Graham here in the U.S. openly calling for the U.S. to preemptively destroy Iranian petrochemical complexes. I think such talk is very dangerous. I think Biden's recent trip to the Middle East hopefully was an effort to put a lid on the situation and try to find a path to, if not peace, then at least a ceasefire that both sides could respect and honor. Remains to be seen whether that transpires. I'm pessimistic. I think the milk has been spilled here, and this of course is a very complex geopolitical, very difficult to solve issue that goes back to obviously the Second World War, and a lot of these wounds have never really healed, and so this is why, of course, it's always been on people's radars as a potential flashpoint for truly global confrontation. But you can imagine if Lindsey Graham's desires were fulfilled. Well, of course, Iran is a major supplier of oil to China, and China might look at its oil reserves and decide that if the U.S. is going to choke off one of its major suppliers, it might have to move on Taiwan a little sooner than it may have been planning, and so on. You can imagine how the dominoes might fall from this very, very dangerous situation. And in fact, in between the time you and I are speaking and this is published, things may have changed materially. That's how dangerous the situation is. And so I think it is sort of a singularity event where it's very difficult to predict what comes on the other side. But unfortunately, few of the outcomes are positive.
Yeah, and it seems like the US, they sort of understand the risk that this is. Obviously there's already wars or proxy wars, you could say, on two fronts. The risk of sort of, I guess, China, Taiwan being, a third front. You'd imagine that would stretch US military quite thin. But at the same time, as we're mentioning, sort of the energy security and the impact that would have on the global economy would be astronomical.
Wow. We put out a piece last week called Minority Report, where we commented on the fact that, this comes at a time where the US Congress is in complete chaos. Even still now, this is the second chance that the Republicans have had to name a replacement speaker for Kevin McCarthy, and they've failed to do so. First Steve Scalise, and now Jim Jordan seems to have failed. And Biden looks to be proposing that the Congress would pass one giant bill. The latest number we're hearing is $100 billion. That would include support for Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan, and also border control to appease some of the more conservative holdouts in Congress. Well, it remains to be seen whether that gets done. I think that's a huge milestone. In the piece Minority Report, we commented on how, any objective analysis of U.S. domestic politics would conclude that the support for Israel is far more bipartisan and uniform than is the support for Ukraine at this point, because continuing to fund the war in Ukraine has become a bit of a cause that the right wing / conservative members of the Republican Party have decided to take on ahead of the election year. And so it remains to be seen whether they will couple support for Israel to support of Ukraine, or vice versa, as it may be. And if they separate the bills and they insist on only passing a clean bill of support for Israel, it's unclear what the president and his party would do. We tried to write that piece from a sort of politically neutral voice, just to objectively observe the chaos that is currently occurring in Congress, and try to game plan on how, depending on which scenario plays out, what it would mean. So, for example, if support for Ukraine is stripped and only support for Israel passes a divided Congress, you could imagine Putin taking that as a sign of weakness. And historically, when Putin senses weakness, he tends to play his hand, or even overplay his hand, depending on your interpretation of the events. And when Putin feels emboldened, energy prices tend to go up. And so there's all manner of second and third and fourth order consequences to the news flow. And of course, it must be said, it's incredibly difficult to get accurate news, as we mentioned, about this bombing or alleged bombing of a hospital. Twitter has sort of devolved into it's just the signal to noise has dropped dramatically. And this event, I think, has proven that it's become ever more difficult to determine objective reality from spin and propaganda on that site. And there's no other site. There's really no other option. It still is a magical place. We don't post on Twitter anymore, but we still lurk there. There is no substitute, but at the same time, it seems to me that it's breaking a little bit under the stress of this current series of unfortunate events.
Yeah, definitely. I think when you mentioned those flashpoints as well as like a second, third, fourth tier, we saw, Finland, Estonia. I think it was the gas pipe, and or some type of an underwater infrastructure that was blown up, and that sort of just gets thrown to the back of the news. So it seems like there are people who are becoming, and it could be Putin, we're not sure, it probably was, that they're becoming a lot more bold in what they're actually doing. And that's, is Finland, I'm pretty sure they're NATO, aren't they? So they're actually Estonia.
Here's another scary scenario. So with this, the controversy around the alleged bombing of the hospital, and again, we don't comment on these things in real time because it's impossible to know the truth, and it's very high likelihood that you can make a mistake, right? And you don't want to add to that. But many people did, of course, in real time, and it's not really important what actually happened anymore. It's important what the sort of both sides believe happened, and if the extremists in the sort of Islamic world believe that this was, a war crime, there's a scenario where regimes in the Middle East who are perceived to not be doing enough to support the Palestinians might get overthrown. And then what happens, right? And so imagine, heaven forbid, MBS suddenly faces an internal revolt. And what does that mean for Saudi Arabia's production and exports of oil? It could be that momentum grows for OPEC and OPEC Plus to take a stronger stance against the U.S. and their support for Israel in this regard. And it is a very difficult needle for President Biden to thread. And I wouldn't wish that job upon anybody, because it is really it's an incredibly dangerous situation, and I don't think that we should underestimate it, or I mean, it just needs to be confronted. This is a generationally dangerous moment in time.
Yeah, I agree. So then if we look at, I guess, what we've been seeing in the energy markets, we did have push up to, or I guess if we focus on oil to start with, push up to close to $100, and then there's sort of a pullback. I guess from your opinion, there is obviously that risk of, let's say, further escalations of conflict in the Middle East, for further supply challenges. But I guess, what are your thoughts on where we could see it go in the coming months?
So you look at European natural gas, which would be a flashpoint, especially in the aftermath of the damage to the natural gas pipeline that you mentioned, and we wrote about, that connects Finland to Estonia, which is a major artery in the European energy infrastructure. And by the way, you kind of have to look to find that event. It's kind of been buried in the news. We were one of the few places, I think, that mentioned it. And I think, the Dutch TTF is 60% higher than it was, at the end of the summer, but it's still very muted compared to the energy crisis last year. Oil, I'm looking at WTI at $89 on my Bloomberg right now as we're talking. That seems relatively muted. So one interpretation is the market is seeing through the extremities in the headlines and assuming that order/peace will be restored through some semblance of a negotiated pathway. Another view is that the markets are radically underpricing the tail risk of the situation, which is probably the camp that we would fall in. Of course, not investment advice, but if somebody gave me a bunch of deep out of the money call options on oil, I wouldn't turn them down.
Yeah, it makes sense. Do you think they're maybe underestimating as well the chance of a recession in the US? Because I feel like that's something it's just performed so well this year. It's sort of been thrown to the side, and people aren't worrying about it anymore. Do you feel like that's another tail risk? Or?
Well, I mean, I don't see. I think obviously the bond market is not signaling a recession, and so I think the recession camp has been proven to be incorrect. I think our friend here, Tony Greer, has been banging this drum for several months that the risk of a recession was overpriced in the market, and that he viewed that the U.S. economy, with all the efforts on reshoring, and frankly, the elevated interest payments are an indirect form of fiscal stimulus. We're running huge deficits. Those interest payments are paid to, the velocity of that money is not as rapid as direct transfer payments to the lower end of the economic scale for things like buying food and so on, but they still find their way into the economy and give a bit of a boost in the short term, at the expense of the long-term solvency of the country, of course, but I digress. So yeah, I think I wouldn't think that the chance of a recession on a meaningful time frame is nearly as important as the risk that a full-blown war in the Middle East presents. It's not necessarily obvious to me that would be negative for stocks, unless, of course, oil really exploded to the point where the economy would then collapse, which is a possibility. I mean, again, I think if we see regime change in a major oil-producing country in the Middle East, that triggers, other populations to revolt. And again, this could be something as simple as the population perceives that the leaders of the country are being too soft on Israel in the aftermath of what they believe to be this war crime at the hospital. Again, this is, what the truth is no longer relevant in times like this. And so again, it's just one example of a scenario that isn't on many people's radars that I think probably should be. So if you'd have asked me 2 weeks ago if a hot war would break out between Israel and Hamas, and there would be shelling across the northern border, and oil would still be below $90 WTI, I would have been a little surprised, to be honest with you.
Yes, same with me. So I guess if we look at what analysts are looking at when we're with oil supply, I'm assuming they're looking at the countries that have quite stable supplies. So would it have to be sort of Saudi, like a country like Saudi Arabia, which has always been quite stable, for that, as you said, to have a massive impact on markets, or could it be even Iran or other countries as well that maybe aren't as large producers? Yeah.
Well, I mean, 1 million barrels a day is enough to swing the price of oil $40 to $50, right? And I would question your base assumption that Saudi Arabia is a quote stable country. I'm old enough to remember when MBS had all the billionaires in the country hanging out at a certain hotel, effectively under house arrest until they. I'm not quite sure what the point of that little episode was, but I'm sure you remember it as well. I mean, um, the security state in Saudi Arabia is necessarily paranoid, and I do believe that perhaps not Saudi Arabia. I'm not making that call. I don't want people listening to misquote what I'm saying. I'm saying the risk of such an event happening in a country in the Middle East, because the population is inflamed at what it perceives to be happening in the Gaza Strip, is not zero. Jordan, obviously not a major oil producer, but if a regime falls, the pressure on all the others would be amped up, and the pressure to be seen as doing something to punish the West might continue to grow. And so again, these aren't predictions; these are risks that we're trying to get a handle on.
Yeah, definitely. I saw similar to what we saw in 2011, where it just, I guess, permeated throughout Middle East, North Africa. So if we look at, I guess, the US, they have been looking for to try and not source oil, but maybe hedge their bets in case there were this increased conflict. So I know just recently, I'm not sure, in the past few days, they've sort of gone to Venezuela and that's saying if you hold elections in the next few years, then we'll take the sanctions away. So do you see this as a potential, I guess, benefit for the oil markets, or do you think it's still early on?
It's early days. We wrote about this eventuality in a piece called Molecular Tourism, where we explained to our subscribers why it would be that the U.S. would be interested in Venezuela in particular. And this has to do with the type of oil that the U.S. Refineries have been built to process. And these were built, the last major refinery in the U.S. was built 40 years ago. And back then they were refining a heavier grade of crude than currently comes out of the Permian, for example. And of course, imports from Canada and Venezuela and the heavy tar sands that both countries exploit to produce their oil. And so it would make molecular sense for the U.S. to reopen oil imports from Venezuela, which then allows for more flexibility and perhaps exporting more of the light sweet crude that's coming out of the Permian and so on. And so it makes molecular sense. Of course, it calls into question the decision to kill the Keystone Pipeline, because this was meant to bring similar oil from Canada, which is a much friendly nation with whom we don't have to negotiate free and fair elections as part of some economic trade. But nonetheless, this is the situation we're in. And I think escalating tensions with Iran only accelerate the need to do something with Venezuela, because Iran produces enough oil that if it were to disappear from the market, it could be significantly inflationary. And don't forget, all of this is happening within the context of a presidential election cycle that is just beginning. And so this shouldn't be ignored either. And again, also is happening just at the onset of winter in Europe. The cynic could imagine a scenario where Russia is close to Iran and Iran is close to Hamas, and everybody winks and smiles, and this war breaks out just at the most inopportune time for Ukraine, which was kind of the theme of the piece we wrote called Minority Report, where we talked about the chaos in Congress that I mentioned earlier. And so you don't have to be too paranoid to connect these dots. And then again, one front war with a nuclear superpower is bad. A two-front war with all of the sensitivities in the Middle East is worse. And then a three-front war with another nuclear power, i.e. China over Taiwan, would be, boy, I mean, not good.
Yeah, definitely not. So yeah, if we go back to Europe, and I guess with the energy needs this winter, do you see that being an issue, or do you think if we look at what they did last year, they obviously created lots of temporary facilities to import liquefied natural gas. So do you think they've sort of resolved that, or is that still going to be a risk moving forward?
I mean, absent a dangerously cold winter, I think they'll be mostly fine. I did read with some amusement a report in Bloomberg about how Germany had restarted another coal facility because of a relatively short cold snap that hit the country here in October. Doesn't bode well necessarily for the doldrums when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. and their grid really has to lean on coal. So I do think they will. I mean, the base case is, and the market is sort of pricing in that they will get through this winter. If you look, coal prices are relatively normalized. Natural gas is a bit elevated over the summer, but nowhere near where it was at the peak of the last crisis. They've hollowed out their industry and retreated back to coal. And so, at what expense will such a victory come? Obviously, a very high one. But we shall see. Certainly nobody here is hoping for a cold winter to prove that the risks we've been highlighting were real. We hope that they get through yet another winter. And I do think this is probably the last winter of major risk. There's still this fantasy in Germany that they're going to shut down these coal plants and that this is just temporary. I mean, that's not going to happen. These coal plants will be perpetually extended by however many years they need to in order to keep the game going, that they won't need coal on any reasonable time frame. There is no scenario where Germany can shut down those coal plants. They just won't. That's a giant lie. The Greens have peddled the lie in Germany. One thing to watch in Germany in the winter, of course, is the rise of what the establishment would call the far right. The AfD party in particular seems to be surging in the polls and doing quite well in regional elections outside of its base in Eastern Germany. We did watch with some interest the elections in Poland, which seemed to be a near miss for the European political establishment. So even though the anti-EU candidate won a plurality of the votes, it doesn't look like the incumbent prime minister has enough to form a majority in parliament. And Donald Tusk, which is going to be one of the best names in politics, looks set to become the next prime minister in the next leader of Poland. And so we shall see. But I do think if you pushed me, absent proliferation of the war in the Middle East or Putin feeling extra emboldened, I think Europe should be able to get through yet another winter. And then the majority of the risk, like these last two winters were probably, 80% of the tail risk would have been abated.
Okay, makes sense. So, Doomberg, thanks again for your time today. I really appreciate it. My last question is, what is one message you'd like people to take away from our conversation?
That's a great question because I don't want to be pessimistic, but the one message is that I would think about hedging personally, both your personal lives, your emergency preparedness, your financial exposures. I do feel that even though the name is Doomberg, it looks pretty doomy out there. It's hard not to peruse the headlines and not ponder, starting with your own family. What is my response if things sort of spiral out of control? Because we are at a very dangerous period, and I would prepare accordingly.
Yeah, that's a great message. So thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. You mentioned you're not on Twitter anymore, or you are, but you're just sort of not posting, which is sad. But so would Substack be the best place to find what you guys do?
We are exclusive on the Substack ecosystem, which means we publish at doomberg.substack.com, and also they have Notes, which is a knockoff of Twitter, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. It's not quite Twitter, but it's quite good. We post on Notes like we used to on Twitter, and you can find us there. We are 100% subscriber supported as always. Anthony, appreciate the time. Wish we were meeting with more positive things to discuss, but such is reality, and one must confront reality as it presents itself. So really enjoyed the conversation. I'm looking forward to coming back for number 5.
Yeah, definitely. One time we'll get a positive conversation where we can say everything's going great. Hopefully in the not too distant future. But yeah, thanks again for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.